Being here. It's always great to have you on the show. First of all, you just got out of a long meeting with Secretary Carter. He's been having many of these meetings over the last year with, people in Silicon Valley like you. How much progress has been made when it comes to the relationship between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley, and where does more progress need to be made?
Yeah, so I think we're still at the start, but I think things are starting to snowball. And a big thing is he's actually set up down the street here. He set up a unit of DoD that's specifically assigned to build more bridges into especially the early stage companies in Silicon Valley. Department of Defense 50 years ago was the first customer of all the new technology companies, but over the last 25 years, the Defense Department focused much more on the large federal contractors. There's a much bigger focus from DoD now on working with early stage companies, and that's starting to work now.
So in your view, how can Silicon Valley help national defense?
So I think national defense has become synonymous with technology, with technological sophistication. Cybersecurity is a perfect example of that, but even conventional warfare is now heavily influenced, and the future of it is being heavily shaped by new technology. And so at least my belief is early stage companies and new technologies can play a fundamental role in national defense, and I know Secretary Carter certainly believes that.
What's your ask from Secretary Carter? What's your number one ask?
Well, so the big thing is a tech startup is the smallest high-performance organization in the world. DoD is the largest high-performance organization in the world, and so it's very hard. There's no natural fit between organizations that small and that big, and so developing pathways where young companies can engage and can get results in a time frame that makes sense for young companies, and where DoD can get the benefit of the new thinking and the new technologies, without fundamentally changing how it does procurement, but having a way to basically get involved early is really, really critical, and that's what this new unit out here is set up to do.
What's the biggest risk to our cybersecurity right now? I mean, are we being outspent by other governments, other private sectors, China?
Yeah, well, so the biggest risk, I would say, two things. One is just we're not used to defending against nation states. 20 years ago, defenses were all against, literally teenage kids, right? 10 years ago, defenses were against organized crime, criminal gangs, and now the defenses are against nation states. And so the threat profile has changed dramatically. And then cybersecurity, like other kinds of security, it's inherently asymmetrical, right? So the defender has to be correct 100% of the time, but the attack only needs to work once. And so defense is always going to be a bigger challenge than attack. And so if you make the attacks more sophisticated, the defense has to get much more sophisticated. And I think we as an industry are still in the process, frankly, of catching up to that.
Mark Zuckerberg called U.S. surveillance the biggest threat to the internet. What do you think?
So I think, I won't comment on that specifically, and I would never contradict Mark in anything he says. I think there's an issue globally. I think the reality is every country in the world either does the kind of surveillance that it turns out, the Snowden revelations have shown the U.S. does. Every other country either does all that or wishes they could and is trying to figure out how to do it. And so this is an issue in every single country around the world. And then if you're a company, if you're a U.S. company or another international technology company, you're trying to operate globally, you have to figure out how to operate in a world in which every country is either doing this or trying to do it. And so it's become a very complicated and messy situation.
Cybersecurity has become such a crowded space. There are so many companies. They're very, very niche. Do you think we're in a cybersecurity bubble? I mean, do you think some of these valuations are unsustainable? Because I was speaking with the Tanium co-founder earlier who said, I think a lot of these companies are not going to be around.
Well, we certainly placed our vote on Tanium, so I'm completely in favor of Tanium dominating the entire field. I would just tell you, look, we're living in an online world. We're living in an online world. We're all going to have connected devices around us all the time. I mean, the fact that we now have this new topic of how to protect cars from cyber hacking, that's a brand new thing. And so there's going to be a new generation of companies that just do that. And so I think it's prime time for this kind of entrepreneurship and this kind of innovation.
Now, speaking about the markets have rebounded, as you've been documenting on Twitter, but it's been a really volatile week. Yeah. What concerns you most still about the recent volatility here and in China?
Yeah, so I'm not really worried. The volatility, I'm not really that worried about anything happening here right now. The big thing is just I think the markets have been trying to adapt, number one, to the new economic data coming out of China about the issues in the Chinese economy. And then the other thing is American companies, and you guys have covered this extensively, global currencies have really moved against American multinationals in the last 6 months. And I think, frankly, Wall Street was slow to adapt to the reality now that the dollar is much stronger versus all the other currencies. When a big company comes and says we missed our numbers because of currency changes, the presumption from investors is an excuse. In the last 6 months, a lot of that has actually been true. And so I think people are adjusting to this new currency world. I think, though, the currency shift is reflective. The U.S. is doing really well. There are issues in many other countries in the rest of the world, but the U.S. is doing really well. And I think from a U.S. standpoint, things are going pretty well.
So Bill Gurley is warning startups to prioritize profitability over growth. Mark Benioff told me earlier this week he thinks there's going to be a lot of dead unicorns ahead. How do you think the shakeout looks when it comes to private tech? What does it look like on your side of the equation?
Well, look, so these are, as I would say, that I think situation normal. These are startups. Some of them are going to work really well. Some of them are going to not work at all. In some environments, it's easier to raise money. It makes sense to prepare for environments in which it's not as easy to raise money. To me, that doesn't, though, translate into a call for everybody to panic. I think each company should figure out its own strategy and execute its own strategy, and that's what we work with our companies to do.
So, last question: if the headline on Sequoia's slide deck in 2008 is "RIP Good Times," what does Andreessen Horowitz say right now?
Well, that's reflective. Sequoia is an extremely smart firm, but that's reflective, which is 2008 was not RIP Good Times, and so our general attitude, I don't know if we have a headline, but it's be measured, be cautious, be careful, but also invest in growth. And when we have companies that are growing fast, we don't tell them to pull back because the stock market blips. In fact, if anything, we tell them to push forward and go take down the market. And so for the companies that are doing well, I think they're going to do really well.
You're big on founder CEOs. What do you think should happen at Twitter?
So I'm reflexively in favor of founders running these companies whenever possible. And so I think if Jack or Ev or some combination of the two ended up in back in leadership at Twitter, I think that'd be great.
All right, Mark Andreessen, thank you so much for joining us. Always great to have you here on the show.
Good,
Thank
great.
you.